Via Skype by market analyst Viv Govender. Thank you very much for joining us, Viv. Now let's go straight into these numbers. Were they expected?
Well, to a certain extent, we did expect an improvement because of the fact that we had the local government elections, which provided a huge boost in terms of the number of people that were employed during that quarter. Of course, unfortunately, these were temporary jobs, and once the government elections were over, they were, of course, no longer as part of the economy. The disappointing parts of this report were also to a certain extent expected. The fact of the matter is that the mining sector has done reasonably better this year, but it's more a case of it basically halting quite strongly. At the other hand, we did see manufacturing under pressure. It's probably jobs in manufacturing, and so it's at the service industries. The great thing about the manufacturing sector is, historically, if you look around the world, places like South Korea, Japan, even China, that we are looking at as examples of the high growth rates that really push a country from one level of economic development to another. Those were all driven by manufacturing and export, and in South Africa, we really haven't been able to follow that path.
Now, Viv, let's look at some of the reasons behind the jump in terms of job creation. Any incentives that helped in creating these jobs?
Yeah, like I said, I mean, the temporary jobs were, of course, a function of the situation we've seen with regards to the municipal elections, which is, of course, a predictable event and, of course, a welcome, even if it's temporary. But with regards to some of the jobs, for instance, the manufacturing sector, though there has been some improvement, some incentives we're putting, for instance, in the car industry, to get these car plants built in South Africa. We really haven't seen the kind of large-scale industrialization that's required in the country. I mean, if you look at, like I mentioned, the examples we would use is China, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, basically the Asian tigers, countries that have gone from being relatively poor to being relatively wealthy in a very short period of time. 1,000 or 2,000 jobs is not going to make a difference there. We need to see tens of thousands of jobs being created a quarter to make any kind of difference in our massive unemployment rate.
Now, Viv, let's look at the point that Stats SA made in terms of the quarterly report showing that the weak economy is weighing on job creation. Let's look at some of those intricacies in terms of how South Africa's economy is doing.
Yeah, the unemployment rate is of course a function, of course, not just of the make-up economy, but also just the fact that the economy is not growing very fast. If we had to look at some of the best estimates out there, is what's required to make a real difference in terms of the unemployment rate, the requirements for growth in this country would be in excess of, say, 3.5 to 4%. People talk about the 5%, target for growth in South Africa. Lower, of course, than what we see in places like China, where 8% is the historical norm and 6% would be a slowdown. But unfortunately, in this country, we are seeing subpar growth rates well below our capacity. So this year, for instance, we expect growth to be around 0.5%, slightly lower than 0.5%, picking up to the mid 1.5% or so, 1.5%, 1.6% for next year, depending on the analyst you're talking to. Unfortunately, history has been quite depressing with regards to this. If you look at the last few years, we always find that the current period is a very low growth rate. Next year is supposed to be better, the year after even better. And that's something we see in forecasts at the moment. The current period is depressing, but analysts are expecting next year to be better and the year after to be even better. But what always has been happening for the last few years anyway is that as you get closer to the actual period, there's been these downgrades coming through with forecasts. So even though people are saying next year is going to be 1.5 to 1.7% or so, history would indicate, the history of the last few years would indicate that when we get to 2017, you could expect a reasonable chance that those forecasts will be downgraded to a lower growth rate.
Now, Viv, a key industry that government continuously speaks of is that of manufacturing, and we've seen how government has put in bailouts for the sector. Why do we continuously see jobs being lost within the manufacturing sector, and what do we need to do to ensure that the sector is revived?
Well, this is just two factors. One, of course, is the fact that the growth rate in the country is reasonably low. But that being said, this is not a local phenomenon. This is the reason for Trump. This is the reason for Marine Le Pen. This is the reason for Brexit. We are seeing a global, not deindustrialization, but a global reduction in the number of people that are required to build a certain amount of goods. This is automation, and it's coming to this country like it's come to the US, like it's come to Europe, and it's even going to come to places like China, etc. We are seeing more and more automation being built into the system. And even though, yes, of course, we would be better off if our growth rate was 5%. But even if you have a growth rate of 5% and we had a very strongly growing economy, the US is growing quite strongly. Expectations are 2 to 3% next year for the world's largest economy. That's an incredible growth rate. But they are still seeing a decrease in the number of people in these manufacturing sectors because now we're seeing automation really play a part. We're seeing automation coming to places that they weren't available in the past. And in fact, if you had to go forward, you look at some really interesting figures out there. For instance, Mark Carney, the head of effectively the Reserve Bank of the UK, the Bank of England, he says that in the next decade or so, we could see massive amounts of industrial automation coming into the UK economy. And his prediction, and this is a real fact, this is from the Reserve Bank governor effectively of the UK, is that he would expect up to 50% of the workforce in the UK to have their jobs replaced by automation, which is an incredible number. This is something that's historically a huge factor coming into play in terms of the global economy. And we in South Africa are hitting it badly in both ways. Firstly, of course, automation is going to come to this country as well, but we're also doing it at a time when growth rates are quite low. So there isn't really a huge demand growing for employment while this potential replacement for labor is coming into the market in a big way.
Viv, just finally, we've come to the end of the year. It was pretty much the end of the year, and South Africa averted some downgrades. What can we expect next year in terms of economic growth? Just briefly.
I hope we are hitting our targets and beating them next year, but the estimates for next year are basically between 1 and 2%, around about 1.5, maybe slightly higher than that by some estimates, 1.5 to 1.7%. But my fear is that we've had estimates come through for the last few years, basically always being missed and always being downgraded. So at the start of this year, we were looking at close to 1% and we're getting about 0.5%. Last year we were looking at higher numbers, and eventually the number was lower. So we're forecasting 1.5, 1.7% next year, a number that's far below what's required to really change the structure of this economy. Like I said, it's 4 or 5%. There's a very good chance, if you have to look at history, that we'd even miss those low estimates of 1.5 to 1.7%.
Viv, thank you very much for joining us. We'll have to leave it there. That was market analyst Viv Govender joining us for those employment figures that Stats SA released today.